Most generic advice tells you to cut carbs first, but that's backwards. And it's why so many people who cut carbs still have insulin resistance and high blood sugar. Here's the counterintuitive truth. The foods destroying your insulin sensitivity are not the starchy ones. They are the fatty ones. Excess fat accumulating inside your muscle and liver cells is the actual root cause of insulin resistance, not the potato sitting on your plate. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the 7 foods that are genuinely sabotaging your blood sugar, explain exactly why each one works against you at the cellular level, show you the actual research behind each claim, and give you a specific replacement you can start using today. None of them are potatoes, rice, oats, or fruit. If you want our free guide showing you exactly what to eat, instead, comment guide below. Completely free, just comment guide below. Let's get into number 1. Processed meats. Bacon, sausage, salami, hot dogs, deli meat. These are not just linked to cancer and heart disease in large population studies. They are loaded with saturated fat, and saturated fat is one of the most direct drivers of insulin resistance that exists. Here is the mechanism in plain terms. When saturated fat enters your bloodstream, it gets deposited into your muscle and liver cells in the form of lipid droplets. Once there, it disrupts the insulin signaling pathway directly. The fatty acids interfere with the cascade of enzymes inside the cell that are supposed to respond to insulin signal, and the cell becomes less responsive to insulin even when plenty of insulin is present. Researchers call this lipid-induced insulin resistance, and it has been demonstrated repeatedly using muscle biopsies and imaging techniques that directly measure fat content inside the cell. A meta-analysis of nearly 2 million adults across 31 cohorts in 20 countries, published in The Lancet Diabetes and Endocrinology, found that for every 50 grams of processed meat consumed daily, the risk of developing type 2 diabetes rose by 15%. A separate meta-analysis of cohort studies found a similar consistent pattern, with high processed meat intake associated with a 25 to 41% increased risk of type 2 diabetes compared to low intake, depending on the specific population studied. This is not a small or inconsistent signal. It shows up across multiple independent research groups studying different populations using different methods. That consistency matters. Here's your actionable takeaway. Replace processed meat with beans and lentils at the center of your plate. These foods deliver protein and a satisfying texture without the saturated fat payload, and they bring fiber along with them, which processed meat does not have at all. If you're making a sandwich, try mashed chickpeas with mustard instead of deli meat. If you're making a stew, lentils hold up beautifully in place of sausage. Number 2, fried foods and takeaway meals. This one feels obvious, but the actual mechanism behind it is rarely explained clearly. Fried food is not dangerous because of the breading or the salt. It's dangerous because deep frying saturates food with oil, and oil is essentially pure fat with almost none of the fiber, water, or protective plant compounds found in whole foods. When you eat a meal that is heavy in added fat, that fat is absorbed into your bloodstream and begins circulating to muscle and liver tissue while the meal is still being digested. This means that fat starts interfering with insulin signaling almost immediately, often before the carbohydrates from the same meal has even finished being absorbed. This is part of why a fried meal can produce a more prolonged elevated blood sugar response than a plain starch of equal calories, even when the fried meal is lower in total carbohydrate. A systematic review and meta-analysis examining high-fat diets and intramyocellular lipid content found that high-fat feeding consistently increased fat storage inside muscle cells and was associated with measurable reductions in insulin sensitivity, even over relatively short feeding periods of just a few days. And in a controlled study using direct infusion of fatty acids into the bloodstream, researchers found that insulin sensitivity dropped to roughly 83% of baseline within hours of elevated circulating fat, with intramyocellular lipid increasing in parallel. That is the mechanism playing out in real time, measured directly. Here's your actionable takeaway. Bake, steam, air fry, or grill the foods you would normally deep fry. A baked potato wedge, seasoned well, can satisfy the same craving as a French fry without the oil saturation. The starch was never the problem. The oil bath it was cooked in is what is interfering with your insulin signaling. Number 3, dairy and cheese. This is the one that surprises people the most because dairy carries a strong health halo in most nutrition conversations. Cheese in particular is one of the most concentrated sources of saturated fat in the entire food supply, frequently containing more saturated fat per calorie than red meat. And dairy fat does not just circulate harmlessly. It accumulates specifically in muscle tissue as intramyocellular lipid, which is the exact same mechanism we've been describing throughout this video. The fat physically lodges inside the muscle cell and interferes with the machinery that responds to insulin. A landmark randomized clinical trial published in JAMA Network Open compared a low-fat, whole food, plant-based diet against a control diet in overweight adults and directly measured intramyocellular and hepatocellular lipid using imaging. After just 16 weeks, the low-fat, plant-based group showed significant reductions in both intramyocellular and liver fat, alongside meaningfully improved insulin sensitivity. The researchers, including Yale's Dr. Gerald Schulman, one of the leading scientists studying this exact mechanism, concluded that reducing dietary fat intake directly reduces the ectopic fat storage that drives insulin resistance. This is one of the most important studies in the entire conversation around insulin resistance because it does not just show an association. It shows the mechanism changing in real time, measured with imaging in response to removing dietary fat specifically. Here is your actionable takeaway. Replace dairy milk with unsweetened plant milk and replace cheese with nutritional yeast for a savory cheese-like flavor in sauces and on things like air-popped popcorn. If you genuinely love the texture of cheese, cashew-based, plant-based cheese exists, but use them sparingly since cashews still carry a lot of fat. The goal is reducing the overall fat load reaching your muscle and liver cells, not finding a perfect substitute for every single item. Number 4, vegetable and seed oils used in cooking. Here is the part nobody tells you. Olive oil, avocado oil, and coconut oil are not health foods when used the way most people use them in everyday cooking. Even though some of these oils are high in unsaturated fat, oil itself is 100% fat with zero fiber and zero water to slow its absorption. There is no whole food on earth that exists as pure fat. That alone tells you oil is, by definition, a processed and extracted product. And regardless of whether the fat is saturated or unsaturated, a single tablespoon of oil delivers roughly 120 calories of concentrated lipid directly into your bloodstream, where a portion of it gets stored inside cells through the exact ectopic fat deposition process we have covered throughout this video. The same systematic review on high-fat diets and intramyocellular lipid found that the fat content of a diet, not specifically its saturated versus unsaturated composition, was the primary driver of increased intramyocellular lipid storage in the studies reviewed. This matters because it directly challenges the popular idea that swapping butter for olive oil solves the problem. It does not. It reduces one type of harm while still delivering a concentrated fat load that your muscle and liver cells will store regardless of its source. Here is your actionable takeaway. Cook with vegetable broth, water, or a splash of citrus juice instead of oil. Saute onions and garlic in a small amount of water rather than oil. They will still soften and release flavor. Get the fats your body genuinely needs from whole foods, like a small handful of walnuts, a few slices of avocado, or a tablespoon of ground flaxseed, where the fat arrives bundled with fiber, water, and protective compounds to slow its absorption and reduce the metabolic effect. Number 5, eggs. This one tends to upset people. So let's look directly at the data rather than at opinions. A dose-response meta-analysis covering 12 cohorts and nearly 220,000 participants found that comparing the highest to the lowest egg consumption groups, the pooled relative risk for developing type 2 diabetes was elevated specifically in studies conducted in the United States, where high egg consumption was associated with a 39% increased risk of type 2 diabetes. A separate large cohort analysis covering over 250,000 participants found a more modest but still statistically significant association with each additional egg consumed daily associated with a 13% increased risk of incident type 2 diabetes. Here is the honest nuance worth knowing. The research on eggs is less consistent than the research on processed meat or dairy fat, and the strongest associations appear concentrated in US-based studies, which likely reflects the broader dietary pattern that typically accompanies eggs in a standard American breakfast, including things like bacon, butter, cheese, and refined toast. Eggs themselves are concentrated in dietary cholesterol and saturated fat, both of which have been linked in mechanistic research to impaired insulin signaling and increased hepatic fat accumulation. Here is your actionable takeaway. If you eat eggs regularly, try replacing your usual egg breakfast with scrambled tofu for 2 weeks and track your fasting glucose. Many people notice a measurable difference. The texture is genuinely similar, and you get fiber and plant protein without the saturated fat and cholesterol load. If you want our free guide showing you exactly what a full day of eating looks like using none of these 7 things, comment guide below. Number 6. Added sugar combined with oil in sauces and dressings. This is the hidden sugar trap, but it's also a hidden fat trap, and almost nobody connects the two together. Most bottled salad dressings, barbecue sauces, and pasta sauces combine refined sugar with oil simultaneously. That combination is particularly damaging because the fat in the sauce slows gastric emptying just enough to extend the glucose absorption window from the sugar, creating a more prolonged, elevated blood sugar response than either ingredient would produce on its own. You get the rapid glucose hit from the sugar and the sustained insulin blocking effect from the fat, stacked on top of each other in a single tablespoon. A single tablespoon of many popular bottled dressings contains close to a teaspoon of added sugar alongside a meaningful dose of oil. That's 2 separate mechanisms working against your insulin sensitivity disguised as a simple salad topping, which is precisely the kind of food people feel good about eating because it sits next to vegetables on the plate. Here's your actionable takeaway. Make a dressing using blended dates, vinegar, and Dijon mustard for sweetness and tang without the oil base. Or simply use fresh lemon juice with some herbs. For sauces, look specifically at the ingredient list rather than the marketing on the front of the bottle. If sugar and oil both appear in the first 5 ingredients, that product is working against you twice at once. Number 7, alcohol. Alcohol does something unique that most people never hear explained clearly. While your liver is processing alcohol, it deprioritizes nearly everything else it would normally be doing, including regulating your blood glucose. Alcohol metabolism takes priority in the liver's processing queue, which means your liver becomes temporarily less able to release glucose appropriately or manage blood sugar while it clears the alcohol from your system. This has a specific and important safety implication. For people on insulin or sulfonylureas, this matters significantly because the liver's normal glucose-releasing safety mechanism, the one that prevents blood sugar from dropping too low, becomes impaired exactly when a low blood sugar episode might otherwise occur. This is why alcohol, combined with these specific medications, carries a meaningfully elevated risk of hypoglycemia, particularly several hours after drinking, including overnight. Beyond this acute effect, chronic alcohol intake has been linked in research to increased fat accumulation, specifically in the liver, contributing to the same hepatic liver problem that drives fasting glucose dysregulation throughout this entire video. Alcoholic fatty liver disease and the metabolic fatty liver disease driven by dietary fat operate through overlapping mechanisms, both resulting in excess lipid storage inside the liver that interferes with its ability to respond normally to insulin. Here's your actionable takeaway. If you drink, keep it occasional rather than nightly, and never drink on an empty stomach if you take insulin or a sulfonylurea. If you are actively working to reverse insulin resistance, consider removing alcohol entirely for a defined period, such as 90 days, to give your liver an uninterrupted runway to recover hepatic insulin sensitivity without competing priorities. Let's zoom out, because the most important message here is bigger than any single food on this list. Every single item we just covered shares one thing in common. It is not carbohydrate content, it's fat content. Specifically, the kind of fat that accumulates as intramyocellular and hepatic lipid inside your muscle and liver cells and physically interferes with insulin's ability to do its job. Processed meats, fried foods, full-fat dairy, cooking oils, certain patterns of egg consumption, sugar and oil combinations, and alcohol all contribute to the same underlying mechanism, ectopic fat accumulation that downregulates insulin signaling and traps glucose in your bloodstream rather than allowing it into your cells where it belongs. None of them are potatoes. None of them are rice. None of them are fruit. None of them are beans, lentils, or intact whole grains. This is precisely why the Mastering Diabetes approach does not ask you to fear whole food carbohydrates. It asks you to remove the fat burden that is actually causing your cells to ignore insulin's signal in the first place. The JAMA Network open trial we covered earlier proved this directly. When researchers reduced dietary fats specifically, intracellular and hepatic lipid measurably decreased, and insulin sensitivity measurably improved, all within 16 weeks. This is not theoretical. That is imaging-confirmed physiology changing in response to one dietary variable. When you remove the fat burden, the same whole food carbohydrates that used to spike you begin landing differently because the cellular machinery processing them has actually changed. That is the difference between managing a symptom and reversing the cause. If you want our free step-by-step guide to building meals around this exact framework, comment guide below. If this video helped you see your plate differently, hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who has been told for years that carbs are the enemy. Until next time, keep those carbs high and that A1C low.